Hello and welcome back to Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry we're in of writing and self-publishing. And today I am delighted to have with me the author and publisher of the award-winning Last Lemanian series, S.G. Blaise. Thank you so much for joining us. I particularly love your necklace, which is like a little star.
Oh, thank you so much, Roland. It's hinting, right? It's what I wish for the future.
Absolutely. I love that. I'm all about the law of attraction. You attract what you project. So
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing really well. Thanks for joining us, SG. And I wanted to say, first of all, yeah, the star. I love that. You want to wish upon a star? Well, you always have one available. That's awesome.
Right.
So yeah, we had talked a bit about the different things that you could discuss, and one of the things you mentioned is the idea that, I mean, you've been a writer for you said 10 years now. You've got 5 books out there, and you've done a lot of work with editors. And you were talking to us about how, your peers often ask you questions about the editing process. So we thought you'd have you on to share some of that wisdom with us. So why don't you first of all tell us a bit about yourself and your writing journey and how you got here, and then we'll jump into it.
Absolutely, Craig. My name is S.G. Blaise, and I'm a sci-fi fantasy author. I was born in a land of castles, monarchies, and fallen dictatorships, also known as Hungary. It took 10 years to learn the language and another few years to start writing my first book, which was The Last Lemanian. And throughout this process, I went through a lot of rewrites, revisions, finding the right editors. So boy, do I have some tips for you. Exactly. Bless you. Thank you.
My brother used to live in Budapest, so Hungary has some amazing stories. What a wonderful source of inspiration.
Oh, thank you. It definitely inspired the world building. And the idea actually came to me for the first book when we were in 2012, a cross-country road trip in Europe. And we were in Vienna when I had a dream and I had to write it down. And that was the base of the first book. And of course, you don't just start with an idea, you start working on it. And you can't talk about editing without looking at some sort of structure or some form of roadmap that you create for your book, right? We have to know who the hero, what their goal is, and are they going to achieve at the end? And if they achieve it, how does that look like? So I always tell fellow authors and writers to start the editing first on your own manuscript. And that starts with structure. Check the hero. Do they have a goal? Is it clear? Or do they switch goals in the middle? Because often writers think that the goal is something that you can come up in the middle and then that's okay. It's not. You have to imagine the goal as a river. There is bends, there is twists, you learn new information, you adapt, but the goal stays the same. So that's step 1 in the editing process. And step 2 is to do a lot of rewrites. It's always scary for writers when they hear rewrites because it sounds like a lot of work, and it is. But remember, in the beginning, we learn writing simultaneously as we're working on our first book. So it's completely okay to have multiple rewrites, change the story from that original idea that you thought was brilliant, and it is brilliant, but it's okay to work on it, to change it, and then start your story and always check, is this original? Have I seen this before, right? Is our hero underdog, someone who's relatable, someone we can empathize with? It's the basic of editing is always the macro level, the structural level, and then you can look into the cosmetics of, do I have too many adjectives? How do our sentences look like? There are a lot of things you can do before you look for your editor.
Yeah, you want to make sure that you're giving them the best book possible. Otherwise, they're going to end up, taking longer. It's going to end up costing you more. But also, I mean, if you're sending them your book before it's really fully fleshed out, you might end up having more than one round of edits, and you definitely don't want to keep sending it back and forth between yourself and editing, right? It's interesting too, because like if you're writing in English, which is not your native language, that's also got to have, given you some hurdles. When you write these books, do you write them only in English, or are you writing them in your native language as well?
I'm only writing in English, Craig, and that's because I'm thinking in English, I sleep in English, I drink and eat in English, I do everything in English. And that was that 10 years that I had to learn to completely switch the thought process. Now my Hungarian is so bad, my mom constantly mocks me that I have an accent in Hungarian, so now I have an accent in English. There's no great solutions here, but it's so important to immerse yourself. And one of the best way to do that is reading. And I would tell fellow authors and writers to read a lot of books in your genre, but also outside of your genre. See what works, see how they do things. Anything that inspires you, write it down, let it blossom into an idea. We have inspiration and ideas all around us, and it's important to find what works for you, find the structure that helps you to deliver your story, and do the work upfront, as Craig said, to avoid a lot of editing process, because it does get costly. Usually it takes 2 rounds of edit for my book, and that's just for the line editing. And the reason, because the first draft is rough, and then my editor points out plot gaps or inconsistencies, or the thorough logic is not consistent. And then I work on that. I add scenes, I change structural aspects of the story. So it's very important for her to look at it again. And she does do developmental edit and line editing at the same time. And one of the way to find your editor is always ask, where did they work before, how many years of experience they have, and what type of editing they're doing. It's usually not a good idea to hire someone who does everything, because it's a different type of editing.
That's a very astute observation. It's like what the different levels of editing might reflect the different levels that you need it to.
Exactly, because the way you approach developmental editing and line editing comes in hand, because they do work on the run-on sentences, they look at the paragraphs, so it does come in handy. But if they also do copy editing, which is strictly grammar, consistencies, that's a different brain set. And you don't want to do copy editing at the beginning, because you might cut that scene. Why would you pay someone to do copy editing when it might not even end up in the book? So it's very important to, interview your editors. And if it's okay to recommend my editing company, it's called the New York Book Editor. They're doing the exact same thing that I recommended. They match you with an editor. They tell you where they worked, what books they worked on, so you get to see, this is not a sci-fi editor, it's not gonna work. Or she's only doing horror, and my book is a children's book, right? So you definitely want to know what you're getting into. And what I really like about them is they're upfront with their prices. There's transparency is so important, and not to mention they have a contract which clearly states what they are responsible for and what you are responsible for. If you don't have a contract with your editor, that's a very big red flag, because they can even claim that they wrote that book. You definitely don't want that. It hasn't happened, and I hope it will never happen, but you never know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for an editor, for sure, to be familiar with your genre, because some of them do definitely specialize. And if you're, it's one thing if you're, proofread, if you're just getting a proofreader, but if you're going deep, you want that editor to really understand the nuances of your genre. And unless they read a lot of that genre, they might not be aware. You don't want them making edits to say, like, this doesn't make sense, when it's something that's common to your genre, and they're not aware of that, and that's definitely gonna screw up the whole edit process. Absolutely. I think most editors are gonna sort of tell you up front too, right? Because editors work a lot on word of mouth, and if they end up giving you a poor edit because for whatever the reason is, let's say you write in a genre they're not familiar with, that's going to reflect badly on them, right? So it makes sense from their perspective to be able to say, look, this isn't a genre I work with, so hopefully your editor is doing that.
Absolutely. Although you would be surprised how many out there trying to get into the sci-fi genre, for example, when they only done literary fiction, and it is not the same mindset. One is a little bit more thoughtful, more drama, more happening in the mind of the character as opposed to action and active. So it's really important to do your legwork, look into everything you can, and trust your gut instincts, and absolutely gather recommendations. That word of mouth, as you said, Craig, it is priceless. And I wish everyone the best, because once you get to that editing, you're getting very close to that finishing line of publishing your book. But that's not the end of your writing journey. That's only a new beginning.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like we said, the editing has to start with yourself. You have to self-edit. You have to, tweak everything. Then you send it off. Now, to go over for people that aren't aware, the different levels of editing, right? I mean, the very basic being proofreading. They're really just looking for, spelling, grammar mistakes, right? Then you go up to copy editing, line editing, dev editing being like the deep level of editing where they could even be giving you suggestions about the story, about plots, about characters, inconsistencies like you mentioned, right? Although some of that would be caught in some of the other levels like copy and line editing, but dev editors almost work with an author to sort of improve the book, as opposed to sort of the lower levels of editing, which are really more just making sure that everything that you've written is sort of correct, right?
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to do the upfront work on your own, cut down from 1,000 pages to 500 to 300, because they do charge by, word. Unless you're going for an epic fantasy, then it's okay to have 1,000 pages. I always say that editing is very complex, and it almost starts when you sit down to write that first draft, because you need to know your premise. You need to know, of course, the structure, the tools, the craft that you're using. You need to have some kind of roadmap. Your characters need to be developed so you understand who they are, what are they going, how are they going to change, that character arc. And then you need to know, is this a series? Is this a standalone? And if it's a series, it's always a good idea to have an outline, some basic outline of where your series is going, so you don't end up locking yourself in a corner in the first book or the second book and have to do revision and change it drastically, which the readers will catch, right? So you want to have a lot of upfront work that if you're a planner. There are a lot of pantsers. I'm not sure I can talk about that. I tried pantsing and I ended up in a really deep, dark hole with my manuscript.
Easy to write yourself into a corner, right?
Exactly. And that's when I went back to conferences, workshops, how-to books, and cannot recommend you enough to read a lot of how-to books, see what resonates, see what makes you excited. And picking the right story is also part of the editing process, even though you say you think it's different. But if you spend years on something that you're not excited about, why would you spend money on editing? So there are a lot of things you can do before you sit down and edit your work or send it to the editor. And always pick the story that you are most excited about, because chances are you're going to spend many years working on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point in the sense that, the idea that you want to wait until you're happy with your work before sending to the editor. The idea of the editor is not to take a book that is just not great and make it great, right? Even a dev editor, that's not really their job. You're supposed to come up with the great book, and they're just sort of helping you polish and tweak the areas that need to be really fixed. But you really want to wait until you're really happy with the story. And to your point, like if you write something and you're just not happy with it, maybe that means don't send it to an editor until you are, or move on to something else, because you might just be wasting your time and money.
Exactly. And I have to piggyback on what you said, Craig, is that being happy with your work is a double-edged sword, because we writers, we tend to be so critical about our own work. So it could be a really, really good draft, but we won't even recognize it because we're so critical. So one thing that you can do is, after finishing every draft, which I highly recommend, no matter how bad you think it is, always finish that draft. Then celebrate that you finished it, because it is an accomplishment. And then try to step away for a month or a couple of weeks, just so that you can basically cleanse your mind, cleanse your palate, so to speak, and get that fresh eyes, fresh pair of eyes to look at it again. When we're working on our draft, we get so close to our story. We don't have that, we lose a little bit of that excitement, let's put it that way, because we read it over and over and over again, right? So it doesn't feel as fresh. So when you step away, it gives you that chance to get excited again and look at it in a new way and appreciate what you've done.
Right. And I mean, to just clarify, like, I didn't mean, definitely most authors are never sort of totally satisfied with their work, but I'm not talking about, like, you've written a book and you're like, this still needs to be tweaked a little bit and this and that. I'm talking about if you're just not happy with the story and you just don't think it's working, or it's boring, or it's you've lost your way, the editor's not gonna fix that. It's you want to be happy with the general story, the characters and everything. Sure, there might be some tweaks that need to happen. That's for sure. And like you said, most authors are never happy, which actually leads to one of the other points that we were talking about earlier, is how do you know when it's time to just cut the cord and send it off to the editor, because you might just rewrite forever.
Mm-hmm. That is one of the hardest questions to answer, especially when you're in the beginning of your writing journey, because it could feel like that what you did is not perfect. But here is the best part of writing. It doesn't have to be perfect. As long as you did your best, you did the legwork, you put in the effort, you did the rewrites, you did your own revisions, you will reach a point when you say, there is nothing more I can do here. I need that editor. And it can take a year, it can take 2 years, or in my case, it can take 6 years to achieve that point when you say, I did everything I can. And the funny part about writing is, of course, if I would go back today and try to revise my first book, I'm sure I would find something. But that's the beauty of writing. You evolve as you write your books. You become a better writer with each draft, each book. So it's not really valuable for you to go back and try to revise your first book. Just remember, you're getting better as a writer as you go and produce more books.
Isn't that the truth? Like,
right.
It's one of those things. The more it's like the analogy of the pot makers. There were the group of people who had to make the perfect pot, and there were a group of people who had to make the best pot, the most pots ever. And the people who made the most pots ended up making the best pots, because it's just a case of practice.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I always say to writers that try to find the fun when you write your book. It's so important to enjoy what you're doing, to be comfortable and to have fun, because if you're not having fun, how will your readers have fun? So writing and editing, it is so big, because it starts with, when do you sit down to write? Do you have music? Maybe you need a candle to lit next to you. Maybe you need to meditate. Whatever it is, you develop as a writer and who you are, and learn what works for you. And the more fun you have, the better your books become and the easier it becomes to write that draft.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we all as writers have been through that point where, especially, well, obviously once you've written a bunch of books, like I look back at the first few books I wrote and they're cringeworthy, but as to you know, to what Roland was saying, when you write more and more and more books, you're going to necessarily get better. And I think that the key there is, you know, so practice is going to improve you, but don't just practice on that one book and rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it, right? Because you've got to move on. You've got to tell different stories, meet different characters, and that's really how you're going to improve. If you just keep rewriting, thinking, oh, I'm improving every time on this one book, you're really just sort of keeping yourself back and holding yourself from really growing, I think.
Yeah, it's quite a balancing game, right? At this point in my writing journey, I usually write the book that I'm going to publish in that current year in January. And then in February, March, I start developing the notes for the next book for the next year. So I do work on multiple books, and I try to make the most out of that time. But I also try to include time off, so I don't encounter that dreaded writing block, right? Which often could be from burning out a little bit, you know, pushing too hard, or not knowing where to go with your draft or what to do or how to express your thoughts in a creative medium of writing. So it's extremely important to be kind to yourself, right? Don't try to edit what you just wrote. I always recommend to writers to write your scene, write your chapter, and then if you have to, go back after you're done, or what's even better is keep going forward. Everyone will find what works for them and what helps them to get that forward momentum so they can finish their book.
Yeah, each revision you write, I think it makes sense to have some sort of period of a break or a reflection before just jumping right back. I mean, I wouldn't be like, you know, typing away and I write the end and then I just flip back to page 1 and start over again, right? You definitely need, I think, that time in between. And then you want to almost let the story sit with you for a while. I think we often talk about, Roland and I often talk about that idea that your first draft is you telling yourself the story. And then the later drafts are when you really bring it out into more of a book. And you know, you can do that by sort of, after you've told yourself the story, sort of now let that sit with you for a little bit. And I think a lot of people do that. They'll take that first draft and throw it in a drawer and then work on the next book and then come back to it when the next one's done and start their rewrites.
Absolutely. And you know, one of the other things that as self-published authors, we have to think not just about editing, but about creating a social media platform, having a blog. And what's better way to have a blog when you do writing prompts? And whatever you write can automatically go onto your blog. And it could be fun little stories, which allows you to have a creative outlet to practice writing without critically looking at what you wrote, and to not look at the blank screen and dread it. I highly recommend writing prompts. They have so many functions, and they're a lot of fun to do it, you know, basically.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to sort of make writing fun and to sort of take a break from the sort of heavy thinking that an author often has to do, especially in your genre where you're world building or you're coming up with a magic system or, you know, a futuristic society, right? Some of that stuff really requires some heavy thought as opposed to a story that is really just a character driven, you know, plot driven. Not that there's not some thought that has to go into that as well, but like you're not building a whole world or whole system that has to really work well together. I find that kind of thing can be really mentally draining unless you're the type of person that really, you know, enjoys that kind of thing. But I think that a lot of authors that do write it spend sort of separate amounts of time. Like first you come up with that sort of world and that system, and then you sort of build your story once that's sort of done, right?
That's one approach. The way I approach sci-fi fantasy is I always start with the structure. I always start with the plot. And even the characters are organically meeting the plot. So I don't even know how they look like when I sit down for that first draft. I just know what's motivating them. And what I love about sci-fi fantasy, it allows me to magnify societal issues in a different world that you could say is not Earth, but we still face the same issues: oppression, refugees, or human elements of life, love triangles, grief. And it's a beautiful genre to explore. So I always start with structural world building. I know how the world challenges my hero. I know how it's going to make her face that false belief that she has in herself, which as she faces challenges, she overcomes these false beliefs and she becomes a stronger person. And the best part is she learns how she hurts others with her actions, which often stems from that false belief that she's not good enough, she's not smart enough, whatever is it. She's going to learn that that's not true. And she realizes that she hurt others, which is so beautiful because in real life, we do hurt others with our actions. And the best way to be self-aware and become a better person is to learn that we need to be avoiding that hurt and to recognize it, apologize if possible, and move on. And that is such a beautiful way to craft a story, let it be a sci-fi fantasy or any other genre what's more character driven.
I wonder too, like when you're writing something like that where you're, and I agree, like a lot of sci-fi is sort of a reflection of our own society, and it's sort of a way of saying, hey, look at these people, look at the crazy thing they're doing, and then we're all like, well, wait, we do that too. When you hand your book to an editor, are you just saying, here's the book, go ahead, or are you sort of giving them some kind of things to think about, questions you maybe want answered, like, did I meet my goal of making sure that this character, changed the right way, and that this, reflection of this part of our society was truly reflected well? Did that come off well? Are you sort of asking those questions to your editor, or are you just saying, here's my book, and then seeing what they come back with?
That's a great question, Craig, because with the first book, I had no idea what editing entails. I had an idea, but of course, reality is always different from what I imagined. So in the first one, I just worked very hard, revised, and then I sent it to them. With the second one, I had questions in the email that I sent, and I asked, my editor, I'm not sure if the world building is enough. And then with book 3, something wasn't working that was structural, but I couldn't figure out what. And then I had, those questions of, I feel like the first, the beginning of this book doesn't work. And then with book 4, I actually had parentheses inside the manuscript because I realized suddenly they had a hot. I have to go back earlier and add that hot. Or I figured out the log line halfway through the story that's going to be the powerful, ending that will, make the reader go, ooh, this is very good. So it depends on the book, depends on how much, upfront work I did. There are sometimes when I just send it, like, I don't know what to do with this. It's all yours. Have fun. Or sometimes I know that I need to switch the goal. And I go back and I work on it before she even tells me. So it's a tough one. It really is a tough question.
Yeah, I mean, as long as the editor is open to giving that sort of feedback, and I think especially if you're going for more of a developmental edit, then they definitely would be, as opposed to sort of a proofreader. I mean, you might just get their opinion on something, but doesn't mean they're going to necessarily help you fix it. Another option would be using beta readers to answer some of those questions. Mm-hmm. Do you ever use beta readers, and if so, at what point in the process are you using them?
I used very few beta readers. That was my poor husband who read everything he wrote. And he didn't realize that the marriage vow included, you will read everything she writes in the future. So he was my first beta alpha omega reader. And then as my son got older, I dragged him into, I need your opinion on this. You're the Gen Z. What do you think? Is this work? Also, I'm trying to write fiction that, yes, mainly it's for, female audience, but maybe it works for others as well, right? So the more, the farther I got along with the series, the more I realized I need other eyes. So now I have a couple of friends who I tab before I send it to the editor, or after the first editing when I got the notes from my editor back. But I also want to know, is there anything else that I could do? I always ask that question, what more I can do? Is there anything else that helps my story? So I collect the feedback from multiple sources, and that will help me to figure out what's the pattern here, right? You always look for the pattern and then try to see, is there a way I can fix it or not?
And then, well, I mean, one of the things you have to be sort of careful about with that is how when you're using somebody who's close to you, you have to worry about whether or not you're going to get honest feedback, or I don't want to hurt your feeling feedback, right? And I think if I gave my book to if I gave my book to my mom, it would be perfect. She would have no edits to give me. But if so you want to sort of be careful with that when you're giving it to people, because even if they're not doing it consciously, they might sort of be holding some things back, telling you what you kind of want to hear, as opposed to sort of giving it to more of an independent sort of beta reader or whatever, right?
Absolutely. In fact, last year I dragged my husband and my son to a workshop that was multiple big name authors were talking about their structure that they invented or they created. And so I dragged them. Then I said, you need to pay attention because you're my alpha beta reader, and I need you to understand what I'm doing. And they were like, why am I here? But it was very beneficial because they started to recognize certain things as they were watching TV shows or movies. And we would have discussions of, hey, the self-regulation didn't quite work in the end. I love that. So they got a little too much information and too much behind the scene. But it's a very interesting, when you start to recognize the patterns of what other authors do, how they tell their stories. And again, as you said, you have to be careful with beta readers. But here's the thing. Neil Gaiman said that when your reader tells you that there is something wrong with your scene, they're almost always right. But when they tell you how to fix it, they're almost always wrong. So the way I look at this feedback is that what's the pattern? If I keep hearing things like the middle is too slow, then I know that structurally that means there's not enough conflict, right? That's often why it becomes slow. How do you create conflict? Conflict comes from the opposition of principles and values, and both for the opponent and the hero going for the same goal and butting heads. And opponent doesn't mean they're a bad person. That's a very two-dimensional approach. Opponent could be a family member, right? It's often the closer they are to the hero, the better opponent they are, because they know exactly what that weakness to hit that will hurt the hero the most, not because they want to hurt them, but because they have that inside knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's an important point as well. We've talked about that in the past in terms of reviews, where nobody likes to get negative reviews, and certainly even if you're sending it off to beta readers, sometimes they might have some negative-ish things to say about it, right? And the important thing I think to look for is those common complaints, the patterns that emerge from what people are saying. They're all going to say it a little bit differently, but if only one person is complaining about something and everyone else is fine with it, you can ignore that, right? Everybody's different. Your book's not going to appeal to everybody. But if everybody's sort of hinting around the same sort of problem, then that's when you really need to pay attention and figure out, okay, what is it that isn't working here for people? And I agree with you, like, don't look to them to give you the answers, but they can at least tell you where the problems are.
Absolutely. And when it comes to feedback, probably the first feedback you're going to get from your read and critique group. You can find fellow authors that you just meet at a cafe or in your living room, or you can go to places like a writers, workshop group where traditionally published authors offer some sort of read and critique, right? So hearing a critique is, as you said, super difficult. And one of the best way to handle critiques is to know that it's not personal. Even if it sounds like, don't take it personally. And always look for what's the best, what they're saying that helps me to get my story to become even better. And third is to have an open mind. When you have an open mind, you can sort through those feedbacks. And then lastly, don't try to explain or defend your work. One of the cons of having a read and critique is that they usually see 25 pages or a couple of chapters. So they don't see the big picture that you as an author have in mind. And that's okay. That's why some of those feedbacks is more of a reader's comment, which means they notice something's happening. They notice the setup you're doing. And that's perfect. You want them to notice that. And you don't have to answer that in that chapter because you're setting something up that's going to pay off later, right? So when they as you said, Craig, when they notice that pattern, now that's something to pay attention to, It's the character two-dimensional. You have too many brown-haired characters who always start their sentence with yes, whatever it is they notice. That was a horrible example. Whatever they notice, and that's a pattern, it's a good idea to pay attention to it.
Yeah. And I mean, those are things that you can fix sort of before it gets to the editing process, because ideally you're probably sending them to these people before you send it to the editor. Editor's usually where you want to send it last, because you want, like we said at the beginning, you want as polished a product as you can before you send it to them. And if it's a lot, when you get feedback from beta readers and from writing groups and stuff, they might have very big issues that they identify, and which will then, if you need to fix them, would then cause a massive rewrite. And if you've already gone through the editing process and then you have to do a big rewrite because of some big problem, now you're definitely going to have to send it back to editing, right? So you definitely want to identify those issues first, fix them, polish everything, then send it off to editing.
Exactly. And try to have fun along the way, especially when you're a self-published author, because publishing a book is just one aspect of what it means to be a self-published author. Then comes the social media, then comes events, then comes marketing, ads, all that stuff that's not going to feel every single time like fun. But, if you like it, if you enjoy it, lean in, try to do what you enjoy the most. See if you can enjoy others that's not so much fun, but always find what works for you. And it's okay to do it at your own pace. It doesn't matter what other people do and where they are in their writing journey. It matters what you do and what's best for your writing journey.
Yeah, every author is different. I mean, some authors really don't do a lot of editing, right? They write and then they send it to a proofreader and then they hit publish. But there are others that really rely on feedback that they get throughout the process, through beta readers, through writing groups, through their developmental editor, and it's not a matter of one way being right and one way being wrong. It's just it's what works for you, and everybody's different.
Exactly. And that's why, it's fun to be an author. You get to learn who you are as an author. You get to learn who you are as a person, because we are taught to write what our truth is. And I often recommend writers, no matter what genre they're doing, is to read a lot of pop psychology books to understand who they are, to understand how their character works, right? What are the phobias that they're not even aware of that they're doing, because that could be a great conflict to explore when it comes with another character, right? It's such an amazing, job in quotation mark, because we love what we do. We follow our passion, we follow our dream, and it's just such a great experience.
Yeah, and I think that any author that does it for a living enjoys the process. Otherwise, there's probably a lot
you'd hope so.
easier jobs out there. Well, there's a lot of easier ways to make buck, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know why you do it. A lot of people are doing it and not making a living on it because they love it, right? There's not a lot of jobs out there that you're going to do, even if you're not making enough money to do them. In fact, some people are writing and paying out more than they're taking in, so it's like costing them, So I mean, it's got to be a love for what you're doing. Otherwise, I don't know why you do it.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, this is not a get rich quick scheme, right? This is something we love, and we do it anyway. And I showed my son my earnings, which looks great, and not so great when you look at the real life. But as you said, that's not what we're doing for. We're doing for because this is who we are. I do it because I cannot exist without telling stories, and it's just an amazing experience. And I hope to write on my deathbed because I have so many stories to tell, and I will not stop until I told them all.
Oh, well, I mean, that's a really good philosophy to have. I keep thinking of all the stories that if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, I would never write. And it's kind of like, it does give you an incentive to just write them no matter what ends up happening to them.
Right.
It gives you incentive to look both ways, right?
Exactly. And that's why I always write down those ideas, no matter how crazy and outlandish they seem in that moment, because maybe in 5 years you look at it and you're like, that's brilliant. It's so relevant for today, right? You really never know. I mean, who could have predicted that we're going to have COVID? And we're going to have a lockdown. And now all those books that talked about pandemics, I'm sure they're doing well right now, right? That's life for you. It's unpredictable. You try to predict, but you really can't.
Absolutely. And then writing is what you do to make sense of it. Well, unfortunately, we are coming up to the top of the hour, but this seems like a really good place to kind of wrap things up. I think it's been really fascinating speaking to you. And Craig, what's the big thing that you've got out of talking to SG?
Well, I think that, we really talked about the idea of the revision process in general that your book has to go through. It's not just the editing, but it's all the parts in between. And that is something that is so important that a lot of authors, they want to rush to finish their book. As soon as they finish writing that first draft, they just want to get it out there. But you really want to get the best book out there that you can, and that means really just getting some other opinions on it and really sitting on it, letting it percolate through your brain, rewriting it, getting it polished and edited, because that's the best way to give yourself the most chance of success. But also, I mean, sure, you're doing this, like we said, maybe it's not for a living or whatever, but it would be great if it was. So why not give yourself every chance to succeed at what you're doing? And this is the way to do it, right? Is really like make sure that you're getting out the best product possible. So I think that talking through all that is really helpful, and I hope let others feel the same way.
That's wonderful. Well, SG, where can people find your books, more about you? Where would they go on the internet to do that?
Readers and the audience can find my book on Amazon, Google, Kobo, Apple Books, the usual suspects. They can find me on sgblaise.com, on Instagram, sgblaise official, and on X, sgblaise author. And if anyone has any questions, please hit me up on my social media. My email is inside my book on the copyright page. I'm happy to support fellow authors, and I'm here to help.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful thing to have. We'll pop a link down below into the description of the video. And of course, while you're down there, all you viewers out there, all listeners on Spotify or wherever, make sure you leave a nice little comment for SG Blaise to tell her how much you appreciated all the wisdom she has laid down upon us today. And also, while you're down there, you might as well hit that like button, that subscribe button if you're not already subscribed. And there is even a bell icon which you can click to get notified every time we have a new episode of Fully Booked. So please do click that. We'll be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. So until then, thank you very much. Cheerio.